G'day, folks. This segment gets recorded as a halftime break in our main live stream while we make room for more beer in the second half. Just for the context of anyone coming across it on YouTube. In this episode, in this case, the episode is about the M48 Patton, hence this deep dive into the man the tank was named after. George Smith Patton Jr. was a lot of things: a narcissist, an innovator, a bully, an inspiring leader, a lunatic, an athlete, a nepo baby, and a truly great general. As there remains to this day a General George Patton Museum at Fort Knox in Kentucky and a large body of active scholarship devoted to his memory, there are no shortage of gilded accounts of his life. But here we're going to try and pass out the good, of which there was no shortage, with the bad, which is significant. I just want to be very clear that none of the criticisms we might level at George Patton are a slight on the soldiers who served in the Third Army. A fair number of Patton's greatest triumphs had more to do with the lower ranks of that army than are given credit by the Patton myths. Patton was born on November 11, 1885, a weirdly significant date in hindsight. While we think of him as a very 20th century figure, it's worth remembering that his formative years were in the Victorian era, and there were no shortage of US Civil War veterans in his upbringing, most of them from the losing side. Patton's family were real, old-school establishment money. His family claim no less than 16 of his ancestors were signatories of the, wait for it, no, it wasn't the Declaration of Independence. They're hanging this hat on the goddamn Magna Carta, signed by barons in 1215. His grandfather, George S. Patton Sr., was a colonel in the Confederate Army who died in the service of that cause. Patton's uncle, Waller T. Patton, died at Gettysburg commanding the 7th Virginia Infantry in Pickett's charge. George S. Patton, the father, was too young to fight for slavery and the rights of plantation owners, but studied at the Virginia Military Institute before becoming a lawyer in California and the mayor of San Marino, one of the wealthiest cities in the United States in terms of household income. In fact, when you include George C. Scott, who played Patton in the 1970 movie, there's altogether too many Georges in this story. As a young man, Patton struggled with reading, something he very much overcame in later life, and his academic career was poor to middling, despite his teachers describing him as bright. Any underachievers watching will sympathise. To give a sense of how juiced up the young Patton was in the establishment, his sister was engaged for a time to General John Pershing. Or, to put it another way, his favourite sports were polo, yachting, and sword fencing. And yes, for the sword nerds, I know it's just fencing, but I'm trying to be clear for folks who don't have your knowledge. At the Virginia Military Institute, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, he was no good with reading and writing, but apparently excelled in uniform and appearance inspection, as well as military drill. All hat and no cattle, some would say. The US Senator for California, Thomas R. Bard, nominated Patton to West Point, where he started in 1905. And in that unforgiving academic environment, drill and spit polish could not carry young George through, and he was forced to repeat his first year. Football was a brief flirtation, but he kept getting injured, so he took up sword fencing and track and field, which led to a career in modern pentathlon. That is the Olympic sport combining swimming, horse riding, fencing, running, and pistol shooting, or things white rich people like. Really should have a yachting category in there too, shouldn't they? In 1909, Patton graduated in the middle of his class and was commissioned into the cavalry. Let's note he was a few years older than the class the stars fell on, who graduated in 1915. So began a long period of George doing whatever the hell he wanted. If he was assigned a posting he didn't like, then he'd make a pest of himself at the highest levels until something better was made available for him. And one infers some other poor bastard with parents who weren't as well connected had to go and do the job George didn't want at short notice. In 1910, aged 24, Patton married Beatrice Banning Eyre of the Baltimore industrialist Eyre family. The Eyres were big in coal, textiles, and medicines. Beatrice was herself a formidable woman and would die in 1953 after falling off a horse in a fox hunt. In 1912, George was selected to represent the USA in his beloved pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics. For a sense of how things worked back then, the 42 pentathlon competitors that year were all officers from their respective countries. The first 4 places in the competition were all won by Swedes on their home turf, with Patton placing 5th as the highest ranking non-Swede. Controversially, while all the other entrants used .22 caliber sporting pistols for that section, George came in waving a .38 caliber US Army issue pistol, tearing huge holes in the target, and it's possible to likely he lost crucial points with follow-up shots not being detectable due to the enormous bullet holes he was making in the target. These days, a moving backdrop is used to prevent this problem. Credit where it is due, Patton showed good sportsmanship throughout this, despite the likelihood he would have won an Olympic medal. On the other hand, if he'd trained with and brought the appropriate firearm, he could have avoided the problem. As a young and very wealthy gentleman at the time, Patton didn't come straight home after the Olympics, but went to Somme in France to study fencing with a French Army Master of Arms. Returning home with these lessons, he took a gig at the office of the Army Chief of Staff and rewrote the US Cavalry Sabre combat doctrine, designing the Model 1913 Cavalry Sabre. By all accounts, this is an extremely good thrusting sword. As a broad rule in sword fighting, novices thrash like monkeys swinging an antelope thigh bone in Olduvai Gorge. It's instinctive, whereas killers have the learned behaviour of thrusting with the point, which is more usually fatal. At the Mounted Service School in Fort Riley, Kansas, Patton invented for himself the title of Master of the Sword for the school's top instructor in swordsmanship. No guesses who that was. In 1915, he was supposed to go to the Philippines, but fancied action in Mexico more. So after 11 days of calling in family favors in Washington, he was assigned to the 8th Cavalry at Fort Bliss in Texas. This period is instructive because the young Patton was an unusual combination of privilege and opportunity, but also the talent to seize and make the most of those astonishing chances he was given. As Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, opportunities multiply as they are seized. Perhaps a fitting epitaph to George Patton's whole life and career. In 1915, still a lieutenant in Sierra Blanca, George decided he didn't need to wear his M1911 Colt 45 in a holster, preferring to stick it in his belt. There's a reason holsters exist, and Patton's gun went off in a bar. This led to his famous love of revolvers, particularly ivory-handled ones, which needed a bit more cocking before careless wear gets someone killed. But let's dwell a second on the idiot young officer who took an insecurely carried firearm into a goddamn bar where it underwent an accidental discharge. Patton again used his influence to get himself assigned as Pershing's personal aide for the Pancho Villa expedition. Pershing was apparently very impressed by the young lieutenant, and that had nothing to do with the upcoming engagement to the young Anne Patton, George's sister. On May 14, 1916, Patton led the first motorized attack in the US Army's history, killing 3 of Pancho Villa's men. Patton would take the nickname Bandito for his bandit-killing exploit, and I have no idea if he chose that for himself. The expedition also marked a lifelong interest in intelligence gathering, where Patton appeared to be much better than his colleagues at figuring out where the enemy was. Put a pin in that, we'll get back to it. May 15, 1917 saw Patton promoted to captain and joining Pershing's staff for the American Expeditionary Forces bound for France and the Western Front of World War I. Nothing to do with his sister being engaged to Pershing, of course. To be fair, he'd previously studied in France, which probably stood him in good stead. George got bored in France commanding the headquarters company and wandered off to see what the French were doing with tanks. On 10 November 1917, he got himself assigned to establish a light tank school for the American forces, who had zero knowledge or experience of the vehicles. This led to him spending time with the French tank training school and becoming the first American to drive a tank. Old blood and guts was really right there at the start. The Battle of Cambrai on 20 November 1917 was a seminal moment in tank history, and Patton was briefed by the British tank theorist J.F.C. Fuller on the results. Patton was promoted to Major on Australia Day, 26 January 1918, and his tank school received its first 10 Renault FTs on 23 March 1918. When the train carrying the tanks turned up at the siding, there was a problem. No one else knew how to drive a tank, and Major Patton had to unload the first 7 of them before someone else was able to give it a go. In August 1918, the now Lieutenant Colonel Patton was placed in charge of the US 1st Provisional Tank Brigade. At the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, starting on 12 September, Patton walked in front of his tanks to lead them into the German-held village of Essy, impressing a certain Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, who he met for the first time. In the attack into Pan, Patton rode on the top of his tanks, directing the force. On 26 September, as part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he was wounded leading an attack on machine guns at Chepi. His orderly, Private First Class Joe Angelo, saved his life. In this engagement, Patton himself would later claim to have murdered a US soldier who refused to dig a trench, hitting the soldier over the head with a shovel. The war would end on Patton's 33rd birthday, and he would be awarded a big stack of medals and promotions. In the interwar years, Patton was asked to write the manual on tank operations. With little interest in his job as a peacetime staff officer, Patton kept himself busy writing technical papers. He was certain that the future of tanks was as an independent fighting force, not just supporting the infantry. In 1932, Patton led troops of the 3rd Cavalry into Washington, D.C. to aid MacArthur in suppressing the bonus army of desperate, impoverished veterans. Patton would write how much he didn't like doing it, but he sure as hell did do it. And it's not as if he didn't have the money to support himself if he had taken a stand. Leading the 3rd Cavalry down Pennsylvania Avenue with tear gas and bayonets, Patton realised one of the protesters was Joe Angelo, the orderly who'd saved his life at Cheppy. Concerned it would be bad press for him, he shouted at Angelo to get out of there, which Angelo apparently agreed to. In 1935, based in Hawaii, Patton spent a lot of time bitching and moaning that there wasn't a good war for him to fight, and wrote up a plan to imprison the Japanese-descended American citizens in Hawaii in the event of a conflict. He took time from this important work to drink heavily and have an affair with his niece. To be fair, his niece by marriage, not blood. She was 30 years younger than him. His on-again, off-again affair with Jean Gordon is a tragic business we will come back to. Patton's boosters to this day try and argue that there was nothing physical in the affair, but given that Patton widely boasted about the physical nature of the affair, and his wife definitely thought it was real, the doubts seem to be little more than wishful thinking. There's one other thing to note about this relationship, and we will get back to it at the end. George having wrecked his yacht Arcturus, Beatrice Patton decided to cheer him up by commissioning the world's greatest marine architect, John Alden, to build him a 43-ton schooner. The yacht was called When and If, in the hope of a time George could sail it around the world. I mention this in part because it shows just the huge amounts of money these two had. Not many peacetime colonels have this sort of yacht money. Patton was heavily involved in the massive manoeuvres held by the US Army from 1939 to 1941 as the lessons from World War II in Europe were digested. In these exercises, Patton wanted to get a better understanding of how mechanised forces moved. To this end, he went and learned to fly, earning a pilot's licence, so he could fly himself over his forces and observe them. This is quite the mixture of ability, initiative, and having lots of money. On 4 April 1941, Patton was promoted to Major General commanding the 2nd Armoured Division. And yes, I'm skipping some steps. On 8 November 1942, Patton led the landing of US forces at Casablanca as part of Operation Torch. Following the poor showing of the US II Corps at Kasserine Pass, Patton took command with the new rank of Lieutenant General. Patton invigorated his command, demanding spotless uniforms and adherence to protocol. His orders for an attack on Gafsa included him writing, "I expect to see such casualties among officers, particularly staff officers, as will convince me that a serious effort has been made to capture this objective." In itself, this is a bit of a weird KPI, but for getting a demoralised force going forward again, it probably had the desired effect. If the staff officers are up the front, they're not really doing their main jobs, but there's a better chance of the frontline soldiers getting enough food and ammunition. This also marked the start of Patton's constant fighting and sniping with British commanders, joining the now decades-long argument as to whether the Royal Air Force should be doing close air support of engaged troops or focus on enemy fuel supplies and other logistics. From North Africa, Patton moved on to the invasion of Sicily and began the conflict with British General Bernard Montgomery that would define the rest of his life. In Sicily, his troops carried out the Biscari massacre of prisoners of war, and Patton's response was damning of himself. "I told Bradley that it was probably an exaggeration, but in any case, to tell the officer to certify that the dead men were snipers, or had attempted to escape, or something, as it would make a stink in the press and also would make the civilians mad. Anyhow, they are dead, so nothing can be done about it." In Sicily, when not covering up war crimes or doing important general stuff, Patton found time to get down to the hospitals and slap and abuse shell-shocked soldiers. This was too much, and Eisenhower forced Patton to apologise to the soldiers concerned and to the witnesses of his behaviour. Efforts to keep the story out of the media failed. Not everyone in the US Army loved Patton, and he was stood down from active commands for 11 months. In this time, particularly galling for Patton was the promotion of his subordinate, Omar Bradley, over his head to command the 1st United States Army for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. January 26, Australia Day again, 1944, saw Patton take command of the US Third Army in England with responsibility to get them trained for combat. He would take time out from the Third Army to be the fictional commander of the misinformation grouping known as the 1st United States Army Group. Note the word group at the end of that. The US First Army was very real. The 1st United States Army Group was not. This was part of a mess of decoys and signals intelligence that succeeded in convincing the Germans that the Allied landings would come at the Pas de Calais and not the Normandy beaches. On 1 August 1944, Patton's Third Army became operational on the western flank of Allied forces in France. This was the moment George Patton had lived his entire life for. The Third Army would achieve astounding feats in France and Germany. The Third Army used far more intelligence officers than other Allied armies, and also used light spotting aircraft in the skies to direct artillery, combat air patrols over their columns, and constant pressure on the Germans to deny them the chance to reorganise and fortify. The only way Eisenhower could keep Patton on the chain was to limit his supplies of fuel, and on at least one occasion, Third Army officers would pretend to be from the First Army to steal thousands of gallons of gasoline. To be fair to Eisenhower, he did not want one single army to open up long flanks by being overextended. Eisenhower preferred to advance over a broad front. And if there's one thing German generals in World War II were extremely good at, it was cutting off overextended forces. The concern was extremely real. Patton's greatest moment came at the Battle of the Bulge, where his superb staff work allowed the Third Army to pivot to the rescue of the 101st Airborne Division. No other Allied leaders believed they were capable of the feat, but they pulled it off. To give some scale of the accomplishment, there were 133,000 Third Army vehicles that had to be minutely planned to travel through rural France and Belgium without the whole column bogging down in traffic jams. Oh, and they had to fight the German army too in the middle of winter. Before the relief of Bastogne, Patton ordered the army chaplain to compose a prayer for good weather. When the skies cleared, he awarded the chaplain the Bronze Star. From January 29, 1945 to March 22nd, the Third Army destroyed the German 1st and 7th Armies. Patton crossed the Rhine River on 26 March, boasting that he had stopped to piss in the river as he went over the pontoon bridge. That day, he also sent the 314 men of Task Force Baum to their deaths in an attempt to liberate his son-in-law, Lieutenant John Waters, from a POW camp. 35 of those men came back from this frolic. But the Third Army and Patton have to be given enormous credit for their advance from the Rhine to the Elbe River. From August 1, 1944 to May 9, 1945, 47,500 of the enemy were killed, 115,700 were wounded, and 1,280,688 were captured. And to give a sense of scale, the Third Army was around 300,000 men. With the war ending in Europe, Patton desperately lobbied to be transferred to the Pacific. And for the sake of the timeline, Jean Gordon renewed their affair from 1944, and she was also having an affair with a young married captain to make things extra scandalous. In June 1945, Patton gave a speech in Boston to a huge crowd, including Third Army veterans, and some video of that survives.
Your Honor, the Mayor, General Doolittle, soldiers, ladies and gentlemen, coming over here, there was a very great lesson. The first 4 hours, we passed over a destroyed land, utterly destroyed. You who have not seen it do not know what hell looks like from the top. That's what Germany looks like. That Austria looks like. That's what any place that the 8th Air Force and the 3rd Army worked on looks like. You must remember this, that from Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria, whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed. The trail of the 3rd Army and the 19th Tactical Air Command and the 8th Air Force is marked by more than 40,000 white crosses. 40,000 dead Americans.
The end of the conflict gave him a bleak view. Yet another war has come to an end, and with it, my usefulness to the world. Returning to Europe, he was made governor of Bavaria with a particular task of denazifying the province, a role he did not approach with his customary drive. Patton took time out from Jean to write to his wife, "I had never heard that we fought to denazify Germany. Live and learn. What we are doing is to utterly destroy the only semi-modern state in Europe so that Russia can swallow the whole. Actually, the Germans are the only decent people in Europe." His behaviour towards the Jews in Bavaria was appalling, keeping them held in concentration camps so as not to have them upsetting the German citizenry, banning Jewish chaplains from his headquarters, writing about the dirty and smelly nature of imprisoned concentration camp survivors, and writing, "There is a very Semitic influence in the press. The noise against me is only the means by which the Jews and the communists are attempting, and with good success, the further dismemberment of Germany." Eisenhower ordered Patton to correct his statements in favour of the Bavarian Nazis, and George used the chance to double down on his beliefs. On 28 September, he was relieved of the military governorship, and on 7 October was further removed from command of the Third Army. He was sent to command the 15th Army, but that was just a headquarters staff writing a history of the war. With Eisenhower returning to Washington, Patton got the 60th birthday gift of being made interim commander of the US Army Europe for a couple of weeks. Then on 9 December 1945, out on a hunting trip, George Patton's Cadillac limousine collided with an army truck. There is an irony here that before D-Day, he'd addressed the Third Army saying, "The two most dangerous weapons the Germans have are our own armoured half-track and jeep. The half-track, because the boys in it go all heroic, thinking they are in a tank. The jeep, because we have so many god-awful drivers." He was paralysed from the neck down and died on 21 December at the age of 60. So what to make of George Patton? He was a man of rare accomplishments who excelled at the highest levels of multiple fields. He was an excellent manager of large, complex operations. He was also a raging arsehole, and his ongoing influence justifying other raging arseholes' behaviour remains pernicious to this day. But it cannot be questioned that he created, if not alone, then certainly in large part, the US armoured forces that would thunder across Germany to defeat the Nazis. And to have both created the force and then to have led it is a unique achievement. And we have the beloved line from the 1970 movie.
I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country.
While we talk about that, George C. Scott refused his Academy Award win from the Patton movie on the basis that acting performances should not be ranked. The Oscar statue was given to the Patton Museum. More tragically, Jean Gordon killed herself 2 weeks after Patton's death, surrounded by pictures of him. His yacht, When and If, stayed in the Air family for many years before being donated in 1972 for use as a sail training vessel for children with dyslexia, a lovely nod to Patton's trouble with reading as a young man. The yacht was nearly lost in the storm in 1990, but was salvaged and relaunched in 1994. Here's a picture of her taken in 2017. She regularly takes part in sail training and tall ships festivals and offers public and private charters from her home port in Key West. While the Patton series of tanks were not perfect, they were certainly a fitting tribute to the dynamo in every sense that was George S. Patton. For both, despite their imperfections, you'd be nervous taking them on in a fight.